"You'll be staying in the garage," my mother said, not looking up from her wedding checklist as I stood in the foyer of my childhood home with my weekend bag at my feet. I thought I'd misheard her at first. Thought maybe she'd said, "the spare room by the garage," or something that made sense for a daughter arriving to celebrate her only sister's wedding weekend. But no, she meant the actual garage. The converted garage that still smelled faintly of motor oil and stored Christmas decorations, where my father kept his workbench, and where we'd always talked about finishing the space but never quite had. "We have a full house this weekend," my mother continued, finally glancing up with that expression I knew so well, the one that said I was being difficult just by existing in this moment. "Your cousins are in the guest rooms. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim have your old room, and Madison obviously has her room for getting ready with the bridesmaids. The garage has an air mattress set up. It's just for the weekend, Sarah. Don't be dramatic." I wasn't being dramatic. I hadn't said anything yet. I was 28 years old, a software engineer at Tech Vision with a salary of $165,000 a year, and I was being asked to sleep in the garage while my sister Madison, 30 years old and working in retail management, got married to her wealthy fiancé Brandon in what my parents kept calling the wedding of the century. I'd driven 6 hours from Seattle to Portland for this weekend, had taken vacation days I'd been saving, had bought a dress specifically for the wedding festivities, and I was being assigned to the garage. The same garage where we used to store the lawnmower, where spiders built webs in the corners and the space heater barely worked. I opened my mouth to protest, to ask why one of the cousins couldn't take the garage instead, why I couldn't at least share a room with someone, but my mother had already turned away, calling out to my father about some issue with the florist delivery time. This was the pattern. This was always the pattern. I accommodated. I made myself smaller. I accepted whatever was left over after Madison's needs were met. When I walked through the kitchen to the side door that led to the garage, I saw Madison holding court at the dining table with 3 of her bridesmaids, all of them laughing over champagne and looking at seating charts. She glanced up as I passed. "Oh, good. You made it," she said, her tone bright but somehow dismissive at the same time. "Did Mom tell you about the garage? I felt so bad about that, but we literally have no space." She didn't look like she felt bad. She looked radiant and busy and completely unconcerned as she turned back to her bridesmaids, pointing at something on the chart that made them all laugh again. I pushed through the door into the garage and found exactly what I'd feared. A dusty space that still served half as storage, with an air mattress inflated in the only clear area, a single thin blanket folded on top, and a small lamp plugged into an extension cord. The concrete floor was cold. The small window was covered with an old curtain. This was where I was supposed to sleep while celebrating my sister's wedding. While extended family I saw once a year got comfortable beds and heated rooms, I set my bag down on the air mattress and felt it sink unevenly beneath the weight. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Can you run to the store and grab extra name cards? We're short about 20. Thanks." I looked at that message for a long moment, looked at the garage around me, and felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't quite name yet. Something that felt like the beginning of a question I'd been afraid to ask my entire life. Why did I keep doing this? Why did I keep showing up for people who made me sleep in the garage? The garage assignment shouldn't have surprised me because this was the pattern. This was always the pattern. And as I stood there looking at that deflated air mattress in the cold concrete space, I found myself remembering every single time I'd been pushed aside for Madison's comfort, for Madison's happiness, for Madison's needs. When we were kids, Madison got the bigger bedroom, the one with the bay window and the built-in shelves, and I got the smaller room that barely fit a twin bed and a desk. And when I asked why, my mother said Madison needed more space for all her things, as if my things didn't matter, as if I didn't deserve space too. Madison's birthday parties were elaborate affairs with themes and hired entertainers and guest lists of 30 kids, while mine were usually just family dinners with a grocery store cake. And when I asked why we couldn't do something special for my 12th birthday, My father said Madison was more social, that she needed those big celebrations, that I was more of an introvert anyway, so I wouldn't enjoy it. I learned early that my preferences didn't shape decisions, that what I wanted was always secondary to what Madison needed. When I got accepted to MIT with a full scholarship, my parents were pleased, but not celebratory, and my mother's first response was, "That's so far away, and it's such a serious school," as if my academic achievement was somehow a problem rather than something to be proud of. While Madison's acceptance to the state university, which she ultimately dropped out of after 3 semesters, was treated like she'd won a Nobel Prize, with a family dinner at an expensive restaurant and a framed acceptance letter that still hung in the hallway of my parents' house. My MIT acceptance letter never made it to a frame. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 3 years instead of 4 because I'd worked myself to exhaustion taking extra credits and summer courses, my parents almost didn't come to the ceremony because it fell on the same weekend as Madison's community college orientation. An orientation that was optional, that lasted 2 hours, that Madison could have easily skipped. But my mother said Madison was nervous about this new start and needed family support. They came to my graduation but left immediately after. No celebration dinner, no photos around campus, just a quick drive back to Portland because Madison needed them. When I got my master's degree 2 years later, they sent a card with $500 in it and a note that said, "Congratulations, we're so proud." But they didn't attend the ceremony because Madison had a retail promotion party that same weekend, a party for an assistant manager position at a clothing store, and that somehow warranted their presence more than my graduate degree. $500 for my master's degree, and now I knew they were spending $50,000 on Madison's wedding, $50,000 for one day, for flowers and cake, and a dress Madison would wear once, while my education, my achievements, my actual accomplishments that would shape my entire career, warranted a card with a check that wouldn't even cover 1 month's rent. I made $165,000 a year now as a senior software engineer at TechVision, a respected tech company where I led a team of 12 people, where I designed systems that processed millions of transactions, where I was considered a rising star in my department, but my family never asked about my work, never showed interest in what I did, never acknowledged that I'd built a successful career by 28. Meanwhile, Madison's retail management job, which paid maybe $45,000 a year, was constantly discussed and praised, with my mother telling relatives about Madison's leadership skills and people management abilities, as if she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing a staff of part-time employees at a mall store. "Madison needs more support," my father had told me once when I asked why they'd given her money for a car down payment, but hadn't helped me at all when I'd bought mine. "You've always been self-sufficient, Sarah. You don't need our help the way she does." Self-sufficient wasn't a compliment in my family. It was an excuse to ignore me, to give me less, to expect me to handle everything alone while they poured their attention and resources into Madison. I barely slept that first night in the garage, waking up every hour when the air mattress deflated slightly, or when the space heater cycled off and the cold seeped through the thin blanket, and by the time morning came, I was exhausted and stiff. But I dragged myself into the house at 7 because Madison had texted the night before that everyone was meeting for breakfast at 8. The kitchen was already full of activity when I walked in, still wearing the same clothes I'd slept in because I'd had to dig through my bag in the dim garage to find anything clean, and I found Madison holding court at the dining table surrounded by her 4 bridesmaids, plus her maid of honor, Jenna, all of them already dressed in matching silk robes with their names embroidered on the back, their hair in loose waves, their makeup perfect even this early in the morning. They were laughing about something, drinking mimosas that my mother was pouring, and there was a spread of catered breakfast food covering the table, fruit and pastries and quiches, the kind of elaborate setup that would have made me feel special if I'd been included in it. "Oh, Sarah's here," Madison said when she noticed me standing in the doorway, and her tone was bright but somehow made me feel like I'd interrupted something private. "We're just going over the timeline for today. We have hair and makeup at 10, then photos at the botanical gardens at 2, then the rehearsal dinner at 6. I noticed she said we in a way that didn't include me, and when I looked at the timeline printed out on the table, my name wasn't on it anywhere. One of the bridesmaids, a woman named Ashley who I'd met briefly at the engagement party, glanced at me with something that might have been sympathy, but she didn't say anything, just looked back down at her mimosa. "Where did you end up sleeping?" another bridesmaid asked me, and I could tell from her tone that she already knew that this was somehow funny to them. "Oh, Sarah's in the garage," Madison said before I could answer, and she laughed a little, not meanly exactly, but not kindly either. "She's always been so low maintenance, she doesn't mind. Right, Sarah?" Everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to confirm that I didn't mind sleeping in a cold garage while they'd all stayed in a hotel that my parents had paid for, the nice hotel downtown with room service and heated floors and those fancy rain shower heads. "It's fine," I heard myself say, because what else could I say in that moment with all of them watching me, with my mother standing right there nodding like I was being so reasonable and accommodating. "Sarah understands family sacrifices," my mother added, pouring another mimosa. "She's always been so good about being flexible." Flexible, as if I had a choice, as if I'd volunteered to sleep in the garage instead of being assigned there like an afterthought. The bridesmaids went back to their conversation about the day's schedule, and I stood there for another moment before my mother handed me a list of errands that needed to be done, things that had been forgotten or needed to be picked up, and I realized that this was my role for the weekend. Not sister or family member, but helper, assistant, the person who ran errands while everyone else got ready and took photos and drank champagne. "Can you get these done by noon?" my mother asked. And I took the list and nodded because this too was part of the pattern, the part where I made myself useful, where I proved my worth through service rather than simply being valued for existing. I left the house and drove to 3 different stores, picking up name cards and ribbon and a specific brand of sparkling water that Madison wanted, and by the time I got back, the bridesmaids were gone to their hair appointments, and my mother was on the phone with the florist, and no one asked if I wanted breakfast, or if I needed anything, or if I was okay, because in my family, those questions were reserved for Madison, and I was just supposed to understand. The rehearsal dinner was held at Castellano's, an upscale Italian restaurant with exposed brick walls and those Edison bulb chandeliers that cost more per fixture than my monthly car payment. And when I arrived at 6:30, following the address my mother had texted me that afternoon, I found the private dining room already filled with wedding party members and family, everyone holding cocktails and laughing in that performative way people do at events where they're supposed to be having a good time. A hostess checked my name off a list and gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, and I made my way through clusters of Brandon's family members who I'd never met, past the bridesmaids in their coordinated cocktail dresses, past my parents who were deep in conversation with Brandon's parents and didn't notice me arriving, until I reached the table assignments and found my name card at table 4, which was in the far corner of the room. The table furthest from where Madison and Brandon sat at the head table with the wedding party. I was seated with cousins I barely knew. Second and third cousins from my father's side, who I maybe saw once every 5 years at funerals or milestone birthdays. People who had to reintroduce themselves to me because we'd all changed so much since the last time we'd been in the same room together. And as I sat down and smiled and made small talk about what everyone was doing now, I watched my parents at their table near the front, watched them laughing with Brandon's parents, watched my mother touch Madison's shoulder affectionately as she passed by to refill her wine glass. The toasts started after the appetizers were served, and Brandon's father went first, talking about how he'd watched his son grow into a fine man and how thrilled he was to welcome Madison into their family. And then my father stood up with his wine glass raised, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, some part of me still hoping that maybe he would mention both his daughters, that maybe this would be a moment where I was included in the family narrative. "Karen and I have watched Madison grow from a spirited little girl into a remarkable woman," my father began, and his voice was thick with emotion in a way I'd never heard it when he talked about me. She's brought so much joy into our lives, so much light and laughter, and we've been blessed to be her parents through every step of her journey. He talked about Madison's creativity, her warmth, her ability to make friends wherever she went, and he talked about how happy they were that she'd found Brandon, who clearly adored her and would take care of her the way she deserved. My mother was crying, actually crying, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, and when my father finished his toast with, "To Madison and Brandon, may your life together be filled with all the happiness you both deserve," everyone raised their glasses and cheered. And I raised mine too, automatically, even though I felt hollow inside. Even though my father had just given a 5-minute speech about his daughter without acknowledging that he had another one sitting 30 feet away, Brandon's mother spoke next, welcoming Madison into their family and talking about what a wonderful family Madison came from, gesturing toward my parents and then making a vague sweeping motion that might have included me, but probably didn't. And through all of this, I sat at table 4 with my distant cousins, and one of them, a guy named Josh, who I remembered being funny at my grandmother's funeral 3 years ago, leaned over and asked what I was doing now for work. "I'm a software engineer," I said quietly, not wanting to draw attention, remembering that I was supposed to stay in the background this weekend. "I work for Tech Vision in Seattle." Josh's eyes widened slightly and he said, "Wait, you work for Tech Vision? That's huge. My company uses your payment processing system. You guys are basically industry standard now." Another cousin overheard and asked me about it, and for just a moment I felt seen, felt like someone was actually interested in what I'd accomplished. And I started to explain a project I'd led last year, but I noticed Madison glancing over at our table with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between annoyance and displeasure, and I trailed off mid-sentence. Later, after dinner but before dessert, Madison found me near the bathroom hallway and pulled me aside with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, can you do me a favor this weekend?" she asked, and her voice was light, but had an edge underneath. "Can you not talk about your job stuff? This is my time, and I just want the focus to stay on the wedding, not on tech things that most people don't understand anyway." I felt something inside me contract, that familiar feeling of making myself smaller, and I heard myself say, "Of course, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take attention away." And Madison squeezed my arm and said, "Thanks, I knew you'd understand." And then she was gone, back to her table where her bridesmaids were laughing about something, back to the center of attention where she belonged. I stayed for the rest of the dinner, smiled through dessert and coffee, and when it was finally over and everyone was leaving, I walked back to my car alone, while groups of family members headed to the hotel bar to keep celebrating, and I drove back to my parents' house where all the lights were still on, and I could hear laughter from inside. But I didn't go in, I just went straight to the garage, to my air mattress and my space heater, and I lay there in the dark, wondering why I kept doing this to myself, why I kept showing up for people who so clearly didn't want me there. I woke up on the morning of Madison's wedding with my neck stiff and my back aching from another night on the deflating air mattress, and I could see my breath in the cold garage air because the space heater had shut off at some point during the night, and I checked my phone to find it was only 5:45 in the morning, but I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep, not with the anxiety already building in my chest about the day ahead and what new indignities it might hold. I lay there for another 15 minutes, listening to the sounds of the house waking up beyond the garage door, hearing footsteps and water running and voices calling to each other with excitement, and finally I got up and pulled on my jeans and a sweatshirt and went inside to see if I could help with anything, to make myself useful the way I always did. The kitchen was already in full chaos mode, with my mother on her phone with someone from the venue, and Madison standing at the counter in her silk pajamas, looking at a list that seemed to be 3 pages long. And the moment my mother saw me, she hung up the phone and thrust a piece of paper at me with addresses and items written in her hurried handwriting. "Sarah, thank God. I need you to run to these places and pick up these things," she said, already turning back to her phone. "The florist forgot the boutonniere pins, and we need specific ribbon from the craft store, and Madison needs her special face mist from Sephora, the one that's only at the downtown location. I looked at the list and mentally calculated that these errands would take at least 2 hours, maybe 3 with weekend traffic, and I said, "What time is everyone doing hair and makeup?" Because I thought maybe I needed to be back by then. Maybe there was a schedule I should know about. My mother looked at me with confusion for just a moment, before her expression cleared and she said, "Oh, that's at 10, but that's just for the wedding party and immediate family. You'll need to do your own, obviously, but these errands are more important right now. We're in crisis mode." I felt something sink in my stomach. The realization that there had never been any plan to include me in the getting ready photos or the champagne toasts or any of the moments that I'd seen in every wedding I'd ever attended. The moments where sisters helped each other prepare for the biggest day, and I took the list and my car keys and left without saying anything else, because what was there to say? I spent the next 3 hours driving across the city, waiting in lines, dealing with a florist who swore they'd included the pins and had to search through their entire inventory to find them, standing in Sephora while they looked for Madison's specific face mist in their back room. And by the time I got back to the house, with everything checked off the list, it was almost noon, and I could hear laughter and music coming from upstairs. And when I brought the items up, I found Madison's room full of bridesmaids in various stages of hair and makeup, champagne glasses on every surface, a photographer capturing every moment, and my mother dabbing happy tears from her eyes as she watched Madison in the makeup chair, looking radiant and perfect. "Oh, good, you're back," my mother said when she saw me in the doorway with the shopping bags. "Just put those on the dresser. And Madison, honey, look, Sarah got your face mist." Nobody asked where I would be getting ready or if I needed anything, and after I set the bags down, I stood there for just a moment, watching them all together, this tight circle of women celebrating Madison, and then I quietly backed out of the room and went back down to the garage where my dress was hanging on a hook and my makeup bag sat on the concrete floor. I did my hair with a borrowed blow dryer in the garage's tiny bathroom, the one that was really just meant for someone to wash their hands after working on a car. And I did my makeup looking into a small, compact mirror because there was no good lighting, and I put on the dress I'd bought specifically because Madison had told me months ago that she wanted family to wear something in the blue family, but not the same blue as the bridesmaids, obviously, which meant I was in a department store dress in dusty blue while the actual bridesmaids wore custom gowns in slate blue that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I was finishing my lipstick when my father appeared in the garage doorway and said, "Sarah, we need someone to help direct parking when guests start arriving. You're good at that sort of thing. Organized and efficient." And he said it like it was a compliment, like he was recognizing a valuable skill. But what I heard was that I was useful for tasks, for logistics, for things that needed to be managed rather than celebrated, and I found myself saying, "Sure, Dad, I can do that," even though what I wanted to say was, "Don't you see that I'm your daughter too? Don't you see that I exist? Don't you notice that I'm being treated like hired help at my own sister's wedding?" But those words stayed trapped in my throat the way they always did, and I followed him out to the driveway where he showed me where he wanted different family members to park. And I stood there in my bridesmaid blue dress that wasn't quite the right blue, directing cars and smiling at relatives who looked confused about why the bride's sister was working parking duty. And through the front window of the house, I could see Madison and her bridesmaids posing for photos in their matching robes, and I wondered at what point I had become so invisible to my own family that they couldn't see how wrong this all was. The ceremony was being held at Thornwood Estate, a historic mansion with manicured gardens and a grand terrace overlooking the water, the kind of venue that costs thousands of dollars just to book for a few hours. And when I arrived after the family had already left in a limousine that I hadn't been invited to ride in, I found the parking lot filling up with guests in their formal attire and the ushers in their matching suits directing people toward the ceremony space. I walked toward the entrance alone, carrying my small clutch and trying to look like I belonged there, like I was supposed to be by myself while every other family member had arrived together, and I noticed one of the ushers offering his arm to elderly guests and family members, But when I approached, he simply gestured toward the entrance and said, "Bride's side or groom's side?" without offering any assistance. I said bride's side, and he handed me a program and pointed toward the left section of chairs, and I walked into the ceremony space, which had been decorated with thousands of white flowers and trailing greenery, and those clear acrylic chairs that somehow cost more than regular ones. And I could see that the first 3 rows on the bride's side were marked with small reserved signs. I looked for my name on one of those reserved signs, some part of me still hoping that maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe I was supposed to be up front with the rest of the immediate family. And I walked slowly past the first row where I could see place cards with my parents' names, my grandparents' names, and then the second row which had my aunts and uncles, and the third row which seemed to be reserved for close family friends and Brandon's grandparents, but nowhere did I see my name. Nowhere was there a seat marked for the bride's only sister. An usher noticed me standing there looking confused and came over to ask if I needed help finding my seat, and I said, "I'm Sarah, the bride's sister. I was looking for where I'm supposed to sit." And he looked down at his seating chart with a frown, and then said, "Let me check with the mother of the bride." And he walked over to where my mother was standing near the front greeting guests, and I watched them have a brief conversation where my mother glanced back at me with what looked like irritation before saying something to the usher, and he came back and said, "You'll be in the third row, just behind the reserved family section." And he said it like it was perfectly normal, like it made complete sense that the bride's sister would be seated behind aunts and uncles and family friends. And I felt something crack inside my chest, but I smiled and said, "Thank you," and found my seat in the third row, right behind my Aunt Caroline, who I saw maybe twice a year, and next to a couple I didn't recognize who turned out to be friends of Brandon's parents. The ceremony started 20 minutes later, and I watched as my parents were escorted down the aisle to their front row seats, watched them beaming with pride and happiness. And then the bridesmaids processed down one by one in their beautiful slate blue gowns, carrying bouquets of white roses. And then Madison appeared at the back of the aisle on my father's arm, looking absolutely stunning in her fitted lace gown with its cathedral train. And I felt tears in my eyes because despite everything, she was my sister, and she looked beautiful, and I was genuinely happy for her in that moment. But I was also watching my parents cry with joy and seeing my father's expression as he walked Madison down the aisle. And I remembered that neither of them had come to my thesis defense 3 years ago because it had fallen on the same day as Madison's retail store promotion celebration. And I sat there in the third row watching my family celebrate this moment while I felt invisible and displaced, and wondering how I had become so thoroughly erased from my own family story that no one had even thought to save me a seat in the front row. The reception was being held in the estate's grand ballroom, a space that had been transformed with dramatic floral centerpieces and hundreds of candles, and those elegant uplights that made everything look like it was glowing. And as guests began moving from the ceremony to the cocktail hour, I found myself swept along with the crowd, trying to look like I belonged, like I was part of the celebration rather than someone who'd been seated in the third row like a distant acquaintance. I made my way to the entrance of the ballroom where an elaborate seating chart had been set up on a large easel, a beautiful calligraphied display with table assignments arranged alphabetically, and I found myself standing in front of it, searching for my name among the nearly 200 guests, running my finger down the list past the A's and B's and into the S's until I found it. Sarah Mitchell, table 18. And I felt my stomach drop because I'd been to enough weddings to know that table numbers that high meant you were far from the center of things, far from the family, far from anything important. I wound my way through the ballroom past table 1 where I could see place cards for my parents, past table 2 with my grandparents' names, past tables full of what I assumed were Brandon's family and close friends. And I kept walking toward the back of the ballroom, past table 10, past table 15, until I finally reached table 18, which was positioned near the kitchen doors where servers were already coming in and out with trays. And I stood there looking at the table with its elegant place settings that matched all the others, but its location that screamed, "You don't matter." And I felt something inside me start to crack. I sat down in my assigned seat and looked at the name cards of my table companions, none of which I recognized. And as people began finding their tables, a woman in her 40s sat down next to me and introduced herself as Karen. And when I asked how she knew Madison, she said, "Oh, I used to work with her at the store before I transferred locations. I was actually surprised to get an invitation since we haven't worked together in over a year." And one by one, the rest of Table 18 filled up with people who seemed equally surprised to be there, former coworkers and distant acquaintances, and finally a man named Derek sat down across from me and asked, "So how do you know the happy couple?" And I said, "Madison is my sister." And I watched his expression change from polite interest to confusion to what looked like concern. Karen turned to look at me and said, "Wait, you're her sister? Her sister is sitting back here?" And she looked around at our table, which was so far from the head table that we could barely see it. And I felt my face get hot as I said, "It's a big wedding. I'm sure they just ran out of room closer to the front." And I was making excuses for them even then, even as I was sitting at table 18 near the kitchen doors, while my parents sat at table 1 in the place of honor. Even as I could see Madison and Brandon at the head table surrounded by the wedding party and grandparents and everyone who mattered, and there was no empty chair for me, no place saved for the bride's only sister, no acknowledgement that I should be up there with them, celebrating this day as family. The reception began with toasts, and I watched from table 18 as the best man and maid of honor stood up with their champagne glasses. And then my father stood and gave a speech about how proud he was of Madison and how Brandon was the perfect addition to our family. And then my mother stood and cried while talking about watching Madison grow into the beautiful woman she'd become. And through all of it, no one mentioned me. No one gestured to where I sat in the back. No one acknowledged that Madison had a sister who was present at this wedding. And I sat there at my table with strangers who kept glancing at me with expressions that ranged from pity to discomfort. And when the father-daughter dance began, and then the mother-daughter dance, and then a family dance where my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles all joined Madison and Brandon on the floor, no one came to get me, no one even looked toward table 18, and I realized that I had been completely erased from my own sister's wedding day. I excused myself from table 18 after the family dance ended, telling Karen and Derek that I needed to find the restroom, and I walked through the ballroom trying to hold myself together, trying not to let anyone see that I was on the verge of tears. And I found the ladies' room, which was thankfully empty, and went into one of the stalls and closed the door and just stood there breathing, telling myself that I could get through this evening, that I could make it through a few more hours, and then go back to that cold garage and leave in the morning and never have to feel this invisible again. I heard the bathroom door open and the sound of heels on the tile floor and voices that I recognized, my mother's voice and my Aunt Linda's voice. And they were talking as they went to the mirrors in the lounge area just outside the stalls. And I stood very still because I didn't want to face anyone right now, didn't want to have to pretend that everything was fine. And then I heard Aunt Linda say, "The wedding is beautiful, everything turned out perfectly. But I have to ask, why isn't Sarah at the head table? She's Madison's only sister." There was a pause, and then I heard my mother's voice, and she said, "Honestly, we needed space for people who matter to Madison's new life." And she said it so casually, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and I felt something cold spread through my chest as I stood frozen in that bathroom stall, listening to my own mother explain why I didn't matter enough to sit with my family. Aunt Linda said something I couldn't quite hear, her voice quieter, probably pushing back, and then my mother continued. "Sarah's never really fit in with the family anyway. She's so serious and boring with her computer stuff. You know how she is." And I heard her laugh, actually laugh, as she said it. And Aunt Linda said, "She's a software engineer at a major company. That's quite an accomplishment." And my mother made a dismissive sound and said, "Madison specifically asked that Sarah not be in photos too much. She didn't want someone that plain in her aesthetic. And you know Madison has an eye for these things." I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just stood there with my hand over my mouth while my mother kept talking, saying, Plus, Sarah never contributes much anyway. Madison needed so much help planning this wedding, and Sarah just has her little job. And those words, her little job, the job that paid me $165,000 a year. The job I'd earned with a full scholarship to MIT and years of hard work. The job that had let me support myself completely since I was 22 years old while Madison still asked our parents for money to cover her rent, and my mother was calling it my little job like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I heard them washing their hands and touching up their makeup, and then they left. And I stayed in that stall for another 5 minutes, just trying to process what I'd heard. And I realized that this wasn't new. This wasn't some temporary frustration or wedding stress. This was what they actually thought of me, what they'd probably always thought of me, and everything crystallized in that moment. Every slight and dismissal and time I'd been overlooked or pushed aside or made to feel like I was asking for too much by simply wanting to be treated like I mattered. And I understood with sudden and complete clarity that I had been seeking approval and love from people who were never going to give it to me, who saw me as someone boring and plain and not worth including in their aesthetic. And I made a decision right there in that bathroom stall at my sister's reception while I sat at table 18 near the kitchen doors. I was leaving, and I wasn't coming back. I walked back out of that bathroom and through the reception hall, moving like I was in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. And everything looked different now. The elegant decorations and the happy guests and the beautiful celebration all felt like a stage set that I had never been meant to be part of. And I made my way back to table 18 where Karen and Derek were eating their salads, and I picked up my small clutch purse, and Karen looked up at me and asked if I was okay, and I said, "I'm not feeling well. I think I need to go." And she looked concerned and said something about hoping I felt better, but I was already walking away, walking toward the exit, while at the head table my family laughed and toasted and celebrated, and not one of them looked up. Not one of them noticed me leaving. And that felt fitting somehow, appropriate even, that I could walk out of my sister's wedding reception and disappear, and no one from my own family would see me go. I got to the parking lot and found my car. The Tesla Model 3 that I'd saved up for and bought myself 2 years ago when I got my promotion, the car that my father had said was impractical and my mother had called showy. And I got in and closed the door and sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, and my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. And I felt like I was coming apart and pulling myself together at the same time, like something that had been holding me in place for 28 years had finally snapped, and I was either falling or flying, I couldn't tell which. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot and drove away from the estate, away from the wedding, away from my family. And I didn't go back toward my parents' house where my overnight bag was still sitting in that cold garage. I couldn't face going back there, couldn't stand the thought of sleeping on that air mattress one more night. And instead I drove toward the city, toward downtown where the tall buildings and the lights felt anonymous and safe. And I pulled up my phone at a red light and opened the Marriott app and searched for hotels and found a luxury property that I'd stayed at once for a work conference. And I had enough points from all my business travel to book a suite, so I did. Right there at the red light, I booked myself a suite with a king bed and a soaking tub and room service. And when the light turned green, I drove toward the hotel feeling like I was escaping something, like I was finally doing something for myself instead of accommodating everyone else's needs and expectations and aesthetic preferences. I checked in at the elegant front desk, and the woman working there welcomed me warmly and asked if I was in town for business, and I said, "No, just needed a break." And she smiled and said, "Well, you picked a great place for it." And she upgraded me to a corner suite because of my reward status. And I took the elevator up to the 15th floor and found my room and opened the door and just stood there, looking at the beautiful space with its view of the city and its comfortable furniture and its soft robes and its complete absence of anyone who thought I was boring or plain or didn't fit their aesthetic. I ordered room service, a steak and a glass of wine, and a piece of chocolate cake, food I actually wanted, instead of the plated chicken that was probably being served at table 18 right now. And I sat by the window eating my dinner and watching the city lights, and my phone started buzzing with texts and calls, and I looked at the screen and saw my mother's name, and then Madison's name, and then my father's name, and the texts started coming through. "Where are you?" from my mother. And then, "Madison wants a sister photo." And I didn't respond, just watched the messages pile up. And then Madison texted, "This is so typical of you to make things about yourself." And my father texted, "You're embarrassing us by leaving early." And I felt that old familiar guilt start to rise up, that feeling that I was being difficult or dramatic or selfish. But then I remembered my mother's voice in that bathroom saying, I didn't matter, saying I was plain and boring, saying I had my little job. And I turned my phone to Do Not Disturb and set it face down on the nightstand, and finished my cake, and took a long bath, and got into that comfortable king bed with its soft sheets and down pillows. And I slept through the night for the first time since I'd arrived for this wedding weekend. Finally able to breathe, finally able to rest, finally alone in a space where no one was telling me I didn't fit. I woke up in that hotel bed the next morning to sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a brief, disoriented moment, I couldn't remember where I was. And then it all came flooding back: the wedding, the bathroom conversation, the quiet exit. And I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw that I had 47 missed calls, and the notification screen was completely filled with text messages. And I scrolled through them, feeling like I was reading communications from another life, from people who couldn't possibly be talking about the same weekend I'd just experienced. My mother had sent 6 messages starting at 9 o'clock the night before. "Where are you?" And then, "Sarah, this isn't funny. Madison is asking for you." And then at 11:30, "How could you abandon your sister on her wedding day?" And the word abandon sat heavy in my chest because I'd been right there, sitting at table 18, invisible and dismissed, and leaving that reception wasn't abandonment, it was self-preservation. Madison had sent a message at 10:15 that said, "You ruined my reception. People noticed you were gone." Which was almost funny because no one had noticed I was there when I was actually sitting in that ballroom. But apparently my absence was more visible than my presence had ever been. And then she'd sent another message at midnight. "This is so typical of you to make everything about yourself." And I read that twice, trying to understand how quietly leaving a party where I'd been marginalized and insulted could be considered making things about myself. And I realized that in their eyes, my only acceptable role was to be present and grateful and invisible, and any deviation from that, even disappearing entirely, was selfish. My father had left 3 voicemails and sent 2 texts, the last one saying, "You're embarrassing us by leaving early. Call me immediately." And I could hear his disappointed voice in my head, that tone he'd used my entire life when I'd somehow failed to meet expectations I didn't know existed. And I scrolled further and saw messages from cousins and aunts and uncles, most of them some version of, "Where did you go?" or "Is everything okay?" And they ranged from concerned to accusatory, and I felt that familiar guilt rising up, that feeling that I'd done something wrong by not just enduring whatever treatment came my way. But then I saw a message from Ashley, the bridesmaid who'd been kind to me during the breakfast, and her message said, "I don't blame you, that was messed up." And I stared at those words, feeling something loosen in my chest, and I opened the thread and typed back, "Thank you for saying that." I overheard my mother in the bathroom saying I didn't matter, and that I was too plain for Madison's aesthetic. And I hit send before I could second guess whether I should be sharing this with someone who was essentially a stranger. And Ashley responded immediately. "I heard Madison say worse during planning. You deserve so much better than how they treated you." I sat there in that comfortable hotel bed, reading Ashley's words over and over. And something shifted in me, because this was someone who'd witnessed the wedding weekend from the inside, who'd been part of Madison's inner circle, and she was validating what I'd experienced, confirming that it wasn't in my head, or an overreaction, or me being too sensitive, and I made a decision right then that I wasn't going back to my regular life immediately, wasn't going to rush back to my apartment and pretend everything was normal. And I opened the hotel app and extended my reservation for another week. And then I ordered room service breakfast and took a long shower and got dressed and took myself out into the city. And I went shopping at stores I normally walked past. And I bought myself a cashmere sweater that cost more than I'd usually spend. And I had lunch at a restaurant with white tablecloths and excellent wine. And I sent an email to my boss at TechVision saying I'd be taking the vacation days I'd scheduled for this week. And I spent the afternoon walking through the city feeling like I was decompressing from something, like years of pressure were slowly releasing, and I started making a list in my mind of what I would and wouldn't accept going forward. Boundaries I'd never articulated before because I'd never imagined I'd need them with my own family. 3 days after the wedding, I was still at the hotel working my way through the vacation days I'd originally scheduled for this trip. And I was sitting in the suite's comfortable armchair reading a book when my phone buzzed with notification after notification from the family group chat, the one that included my parents, Madison, me, and a handful of close relatives, and I opened it to see a flurry of messages about a gift opening gathering at my parents' house that afternoon. Madison and Brandon were back from their mini-moon, the 3-day trip to a nearby resort that they'd taken immediately after the wedding since their actual honeymoon to Italy was planned for later in the year. And apparently there was going to be a family gathering to open wedding gifts and celebrate the newlyweds. And my mother had sent a message that said, "Sarah, we'll expect you at 2 o'clock, everyone will be here." As if the past 3 days hadn't happened, as if I hadn't left the reception and ignored their calls and texts, as if we could all just pretend everything was normal. I looked at that message for a long time, and then I looked at the other messages in the thread. Cousins saying they'd be there, my aunt confirming she was bringing a dessert, everyone acting like this was a regular family gathering. And I closed the group chat and set my phone down and went back to my book. And I didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the message, just let it sit there unanswered. 2 o'clock came and went while I was having lunch at a cafe near the hotel, and at 2:45 my phone rang with my mother's number, and I let it go to voicemail, and then she called again at 2:50, and again at 3, and finally at 3:15 I answered. And before I could even say hello, she said, "Where are you? Everyone is asking. This is humiliating." And her voice had that sharp edge it got when she felt embarrassed in front of people, and I said very calmly, "I won't be coming to family events for the foreseeable future." And there was a silence on the line that stretched so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. And then she said, "What are you talking about? Stop being so sensitive, everyone makes jokes at weddings." And I felt that old familiar pull to back down, to apologize, to make things easier for everyone else. But instead I said, "I heard what you said in the bathroom at the reception, about me not mattering, about me being plain and boring, about not fitting in." And the silence came back, heavier this time. And then my mother's voice changed, became smoother, more reasonable. And she said, "I was just venting to your aunt. You're taking it completely out of context. You know how stressful wedding planning is." And I said, "It wasn't out of context. It was your truth. And the garage sleeping arrangement, and the seating at table 18, and not being in the wedding party, and not being included in family photos. It all matches what you said. It all confirms exactly how you see me." And I heard her say something to someone in the background, her voice muffled. And then my father got on the phone and said, "Sarah, family is family. You need to let this go and come over here. People are asking about you." And I said, "Family shouldn't treat each other the way I've been treated. I'm taking a break from family events." And my father's voice got harder and he said, "A break? What does that mean? You can't just opt out of being part of this family." And I said, "I'm not opting out. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." And before he could respond, I said, "I need to go." And I hung up, and my hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't from fear or hurt. It was from adrenaline, from finally saying what I needed to say. And I sat there in that cafe watching my phone light up with calls and texts. And then I did something I'd never done before. I blocked my parents' numbers, temporarily. just to give myself some peace, some space to breathe without the constant barrage of guilt and manipulation. And I finished my lunch and walked back to the hotel feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, like I'd set something down but was also carrying the weight of what it meant to have finally drawn a line. Ashley reached out the next day through a direct message on Instagram that said, "I know we don't really know each other, but would you want to meet for coffee? I have some things I think you should know." And I stared at that message for a long time, wondering what she could possibly want to tell me, wondering if this was some kind of setup or if she was genuinely reaching out. And finally, I decided that I had nothing to lose since I'd already burned the bridges with my immediate family anyway. So I agreed, and we met at a cafe in the city 2 days later, and when I walked in, Ashley was already there at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee, and she stood up and hugged me, which surprised me because we'd barely interacted beyond pleasantries during the wedding weekend, and she said, "I'm so glad you agreed to meet me. I've been feeling terrible about everything." And we sat down and she took a breath and said, "I need you to know that I only met Madison 6 months ago at a workout class. We're not old friends or anything, and I almost dropped out of the wedding party when I saw how she treated you during the planning." And I felt something catch in my throat, because here was someone who'd witnessed everything and was confirming it wasn't in my head, and Ashley continued, "She said things about you that made me so uncomfortable, like during one dress fitting. She was complaining that you hadn't offered to pay for part of the wedding, and she said you were selfish with your money. And another time she said she was glad you didn't fit her aesthetic because you would have brought down the photos." And I sat there listening to Ashley list these cruelties and feeling validated and hurt at the same time, and she said, "The other bridesmaids noticed too. We talked about it among ourselves, about how weird it was that her only sister wasn't in the wedding party, and how Madison talked about you like you were an embarrassment instead of family." And then Ashley said something that shifted everything. "I looked you up on LinkedIn after the rehearsal dinner when that cousin mentioned Tech Vision. And when I saw your actual career and your accomplishments, I realized there was this massive disconnect between who you actually are and how Madison described you. She made it sound like you had some little hobby job, not that you're a senior software engineer at one of the biggest tech companies in the country." And hearing someone else articulate that disconnect made me realize how distorted my family's view of me really was, how they'd diminished my entire professional life into something small and unimportant. And that afternoon, I got a call from Emma, my college friend from MIT who'd been my roommate for 3 years, and I told her everything. The whole story from the garage to the reception to blocking my parents' numbers. And Emma was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Sarah, I've been waiting for you to see this for years. Your family has always treated you like you're less than, like you're the supporting character in their story instead of the accomplished person you actually are." And she started reminding me of things I'd pushed out of my mind. "Remember when your parents missed your MIT graduation because it was the same weekend as Madison's orientation day at community college? I remember you crying in our dorm room that night trying to convince yourself it didn't matter. And remember your thesis defense where you won that award and your parents didn't come because Madison had a promotion party at her retail job?" And each memory Emma brought up was another piece of evidence in a case I'd been refusing to see. A pattern that had been obvious to everyone outside my family. And Emma said, "You've always been the successful one, the one who didn't need help or hand-holding." And I think they resented it. I think Madison especially resented it. And your parents enabled her jealousy instead of celebrating both of you. And sitting in my hotel room that evening after talking to both Ashley and Emma, I started seeing my entire family dynamic with new clarity, understanding that this wasn't about me being difficult or sensitive or dramatic. This was about a family system that had assigned me a role and punished me every time I outgrew it. A week after the wedding, I'd settled back into my apartment, the hotel stay having given me the space I needed to think clearly, and I was working from home on a Tuesday afternoon when the doorman called up and said, "Ms. Sarah, your parents are here to see you." And my stomach dropped because I hadn't unblocked their numbers yet, and I certainly hadn't invited them over. And I stood there holding the phone trying to decide whether to tell the doorman to send them away, but something in me knew that avoiding this conversation would only postpone the inevitable. So I told him to let them up, and I had about 3 minutes to prepare myself before the knock came at my door, and when I opened it, my parents were standing there looking somehow smaller than I remembered. My mother holding her purse with both hands in front of her like a shield, and my father with his jaw set in that way that meant he was uncomfortable, and my mother said, "Can we come in?" And I stepped aside and let them into my apartment, the one I'd bought myself 2 years ago with my own money. The sunny two-bedroom with the view of the city that I'd been so proud of, even though they'd only visited once and spent the whole time talking about how Madison's apartment complex had a nicer gym. They sat on my couch, and I sat in the chair across from them, and there was this terrible silence, where we all looked at each other, and then my mother started talking, and her voice had this rehearsed quality, like she'd practiced this in the car, and she said, "We're sorry you felt overlooked during the wedding weekend. That wasn't our intention. We were just so focused on making sure everything went smoothly for Madison." And my father nodded and added, "Family is important, and we need to move past this and get back to normal." And I sat there listening to this apology that wasn't really an apology, this sorry you felt that way non-apology that put all the responsibility on my perception rather than their actions. And I didn't say anything, just waited, because something told me this wasn't the real reason they were here. My mother looked at my father, and something passed between them, some silent communication. And then my father cleared his throat and said, "We also need to discuss something financial with you." And there it was, the real reason for this visit, and he continued. The wedding ended up costing more than we anticipated. We had to take out a loan to cover everything, and we're looking at the repayment schedule, and it's going to be tight. And my mother jumped in with, "We thought you could help contribute to paying it off, maybe $15,000. Since you have that good tech job and Madison and Brandon are just starting out their married life, and money is tight for them." And I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, the audacity of it stealing my breath. And I said slowly, "You want me to pay for the wedding I was barely included in?" And my mother said, "Family helps family, Sarah. You make so much more than Madison does. It's only fair that you contribute." And the word fair hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly everything clicked into place with perfect, horrible clarity. I wasn't their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was a financial resource, an ATM they could withdraw from when needed, someone whose worth was measured entirely in utility and dollars. I said, "I won't be contributing anything to the wedding costs," and my parents both stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language, my father's face darkening and my mother's mouth opening in shock, and my father said, "If you won't help family when we need it, maybe you're not really part of this family." And instead of the stab of pain those words would have caused a week ago, I felt something like relief, like he'd finally said out loud what had always been true. And I stood up and said, "You've made it clear I'm not part of this family. I'm just accepting what you've been showing me for years." And I walked to my apartment door and opened it and said, "I need you to leave now." And they stood up, my mother sputtering something about me being unreasonable and my father's face red with anger. And they walked out, and I closed the door behind them and locked it and stood there shaking, but also feeling strangely free, like I'd finally stopped pretending that their version of family was something I needed to keep accepting. Madison showed up at my apartment the next afternoon, and when the doorman called up to tell me she was in the lobby demanding to come up, I stood there with the phone in my hand debating whether to refuse, whether to tell him to send her away. But something in me decided that I needed to face this final confrontation, needed to hear whatever she'd come to say, so I told him to let her up, and I had maybe 2 minutes to brace myself before she was pounding on my door. And when I opened it, she pushed past me into the apartment with her face red and her eyes blazing. And she whirled around and said, "Mom and Dad are crying because of you. They're devastated that their daughter could be so cold and selfish." And I closed the door quietly and said, "They're crying because I won't pay $15,000 for your wedding?" And Madison's face twisted, and she said, "You're being selfish. You make all this money and you won't help your own family when we need it. Do you know how spoiled that makes you sound?" And I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of calm clarity, and I said, "I wasn't treated like family at your wedding, Madison. I was treated like an inconvenience at best and hired help at worst." And she rolled her eyes in that dismissive way she'd perfected over the years and said, "You're so dramatic, Sarah, always making everything about you. So you sat at a different table, big deal." It was a seating chart issue. And I shook my head and said, "It wasn't just the table, it was everything. It was sleeping in the garage while cousins got bedrooms. It was not being in your wedding party, even though I'm your only sister. It was being seated at table 18 next to the kitchen with people who didn't know the family. It was not being included in any family photos. It was overhearing Mom tell Aunt Linda that I didn't matter to your new life, and that you didn't want someone as plain as me in your aesthetic." And with each item I listed, I watched Madison's expression shift from angry defensiveness to something harder and uglier, and finally her mask cracked completely and she said, "You want the truth? Fine, yes, I didn't want you front and center at my wedding. I didn't want you in the wedding party or the family photos. Because everything always becomes about you somehow. Everyone always ends up talking about Sarah the engineer, Sarah at MIT, Sarah with her fancy tech job. And this was supposed to be my day, the one day that was about me and my life and my achievement. And I stared at my sister and saw clearly for the first time that this wasn't about love or family or even real anger. This was about jealousy, years of jealousy that our parents had enabled and fed. And Madison continued, her voice rising. "You think you're so much better than us with your career and your money and your apartment. You look down on me and my retail job and Mom and Dad. You always have." And I said quietly, "I never said I was better than anyone. I never looked down on you. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered, like I was worth including in my own sister's wedding." And Madison laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and said, "You matter when you're useful. That's how family works. You help when you're needed, and you don't make everything about your feelings." And I said, "That's not family, Madison. That's exploitation. That's treating people like resources instead of human beings." And she stared at me for a long moment, and then said, "If that's how you feel, then maybe you're not cut out for this family." And she turned and walked to the door and left, slamming it behind her hard enough that the frame rattled. And I stood there in my apartment feeling sad, but also strangely liberated, like the last thread connecting me to the fantasy of what my family could be had finally snapped. And I knew that my relationship with Madison was probably broken beyond repair, but I also knew that some things couldn't be fixed and shouldn't be fixed, and that walking away was sometimes the only healthy choice. 3 months had passed since Madison slammed out of my apartment. 3 months during which I'd maintained the boundaries I'd set with a firmness that surprised even me. And my contact with my parents and sister had dwindled to the occasional brief text message, surface-level exchanges about weather or holidays that carried no real substance or emotional weight. And I didn't attend Thanksgiving at their house, despite the guilt-tripping messages from my mother about empty chairs and broken families. And when Christmas came, I sent polite cards with no return address and spent the day with friends instead of sitting in that house where I'd never quite belonged. My parents had tried various tactics to pull me back into the old patterns, sending relatives to text me about how sad they were, how much they missed me, how families shouldn't be divided over misunderstandings. But I'd learned in therapy that what they called misunderstandings were actually patterns of mistreatment that I'd finally stopped accepting. And I'd started seeing Dr. Chen twice a week in those first months, working through what she gently identified as a lifelong scapegoat role, the invisible child, the one my parents called self-sufficient, but really meant unimportant. And she'd introduced me to the term glass child, a sibling who becomes invisible because they don't seem to need help, and the recognition of that pattern had been both painful and liberating. I'd built a life that felt authentically mine for the first time, strengthening friendships I'd neglected while trying to win my family's approval. And Ashley had become a genuine friend, someone who'd seen the dysfunction clearly and chosen to stand apart from it. And she'd introduced me to her friend group, people who worked in different industries and had different backgrounds, but who all shared a fundamental decency and respect that I'd been starving for without realizing it. I'd even started dating someone from work, a senior developer named Michael, who'd asked me to coffee after a product meeting, and who treated me with a consistent kindness that still sometimes caught me off guard, who wanted to hear about my day and my projects and my thoughts, who never made me feel like my presence was an inconvenience or my success was a threat. And being with him showed me just how abnormal my family dynamics had been, how relationships were supposed to involve mutual respect and genuine interest, rather than scorekeeping and resentment. Work had been a refuge and a triumph, and 6 weeks after the wedding, I'd been promoted to senior engineering lead with a salary increase to $195,000, heading up a major project that would integrate AI into TechVision's core platform. And the company had featured me in a press release about innovative women in tech that got picked up by several industry publications. And that article had made its way around the internet in the way these things do. And suddenly extended family members who'd barely spoken to me at the wedding were sending congratulatory messages and friend requests. My parents had sent a text that said, "Saw your article, proud of you." Just those 6 words that felt obligatory and empty. And Madison had sent nothing at all. Radio silence that told me everything about where we stood, and I'd realized with Dr. Chen's help that I was grieving not the family I was losing, but the family I'd never actually had, mourning the fantasy of parents who'd celebrate my achievements, and a sister who'd want me beside her, and accepting that some relationships couldn't be fixed because they'd never been what I'd believed they were. I'd made peace with being estranged from my nuclear family, while maintaining connections with the relatives who'd reached out authentically, cousins and aunts and uncles who'd apparently noticed the mistreatment over the years, and who told me they were glad I'd finally set boundaries. And I was learning that family could be chosen as much as given, that the people who showed up consistently and valued me genuinely were more family than the ones who shared my DNA, but had never made space for me at their table. Tonight I was hosting a dinner party in my apartment, and as I set out plates and glasses and lit candles, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of being home, not in a physical space but in myself. And when my guests arrived, Ashley and Emma and Michael and 3 other friends who'd become essential to my life, I looked around my living room at these people who'd chosen to be here, who wanted to be here, and I realized I didn't need my parents' validation anymore. Didn't need Madison's inclusion or approval, because I'd finally learned that my worth wasn't determined by whether they could see it, but by the fact that it existed, solid and real and mine. And as we sat down to dinner and conversation flowed easily and laughter filled my home, I thought about that garage where I'd slept 3 months ago, cold and dismissed and treated like I didn't matter. And then I looked at where I was now, surrounded by people who valued me, doing work I loved, living a life I'd built on my own terms. And I understood that home wasn't about blood or obligation or sleeping in the house where you grew up. Home was about being with people who saw you and chose you and made space for you at the center of the table. And I was finally home.